Welcome back, everyone. In this video, we're going to be talking about Hasselblad. It has been, I guess, almost a year and a half, September of 2022, when the X2D was released. I have the X2D, I love it, I use it all the time, and more recently we saw the release of the 907X with the 100 megapixel back. And so it's kind of interesting because I've reviewed both these cameras on this channel. Probably the question that I get asked the most often is, if it came down to one or the other, which would my preference be? And that's kind of a complicated question. One of the things that I think Hasselblad has done so well with both of these cameras is they've created two different cameras for two completely different types of photographer. And I'm going to go through some of the differences in them, but first I want to talk about the similarities. So both of these cameras feature the same sensor. It is a 100 megapixel backside illuminated sensor. It is incredible. In fact, I've mentioned this in other reviews that I've done and other videos that I've made, is that, I'm fortunate to be in a position where I get to review a lot of cameras that come out. And of all the cameras that are available today, this is by far my favorite sensor that you can get on anything. And it comes down to a secondary aspect of this too, because I don't think it's just the sensor. It's the sensor combined with Hasselblad's processor. It's what makes it incredible. We've got 16-bit images. There's 15 stops of dynamic range at the base ISO. It is just fantastic. And so that's probably one of the biggest selling points for either one of these models. Of course, the sensors on both of these cameras have 294 phase detection autofocus points, and we also now have face detection on both cameras as well. Now, the way this works is when you enable face detection in the menu settings, it's going to draw a green box around the subject's faces. You can move between these. I have noticed that it does put emphasis on the eye, even though we're not seeing the eye necessarily in the user interface. But face detection is very useful and it is very accurate. Storage on both of these cameras is the same as well. There are two types of storage that you get. You can use a CF Express card, which gets your speeds considerably higher because we are dealing with 100 megapixel images at 16 bits, so it's a lot of data. The other option is that we do have internal storage on both of these cameras. You get a full terabyte. This is something interesting with both of these models, and I really think it's ridiculous that every camera produced today does not have internal storage. What's really nice is I set it up to write to the card and use internal storage as a backup. I actually end up reading from the backup because we've got USB-C connectivity on both of these cameras and we get really fast transfer speeds. And so I just let the CF Express card live in there. It's essentially the backup, and I just pull it right off the card because it is really fast. And so that's one thing that's really cool about both of these also. Now, surprisingly, another question that I get asked a lot is about lens compatibility with both of these cameras. They are the same mount, so they are compatible with all of the X series lenses, which includes the new V series lenses. Talk about that in a second, but let's back up real quick. Now, it's a little bit confusing because Hasselblad referred to its legacy cameras, the old film cameras, as the V system. Now we have the V series lenses, which is a little bit different, but they are all XCD mount. So in the digital era, Hasselblad were known for the H series of cameras, which were excellent cameras. They're really big. They have mirrors in them. They're essentially DSLRs. It's an incredible camera, but this is Hasselblad's mirrorless system. So we've eliminated the mirror, so now we have a mount that's very close to the sensor. And so it's the same mount on both these cameras. Both of these cameras are compatible with all the XCD mount lenses that have come out since 2016. And there have been some really nice lenses. They're really sharp. The image quality is just excellent. And that's what we're going for here. This is a medium format system. It has a larger sensor in here. And so the key to that is that you can get a much sharper, high level of image quality. And all of these lenses are excellent. I've got some favorites, but anyway, I'm going to stick to the topic here, but they are compatible with both cameras. Now, another thing unique to the Hasselblad system is Hasselblad actually designed this with a leaf shutter, which means the shutter is actually in the lens. The advantage to using a leaf shutter is it's very different than a focal plane curtain shutter in that you can get a higher flash sync speed. So technically, you can sync up to any speed as fast as the lens will go. You guys remember, all throughout the history of photography, when you have a focal plane shutter, because of the physics of that your maximum flash sync speed is usually 1/250th of a second. Now, if you're doing something where you have flash against something that's already brightly lit, like being outdoors, it becomes very difficult. So you get flash sync at any speed with these lenses. It just depends on how fast the lens goes. Some of the newer lenses go all the way up to 1/4000th of a second. 1/2000th is pretty standard for all of these. So that's something that is very useful if you are into flash photography. And we'll get into in a second. There's also a difference in flash compatibility with both these cameras. but I wanted to get that mentioned because that is a key selling point with Hasselblad lenses. The menu UI is the same on both of these cameras as well, and I want to mention this because this is probably one of my favorite menu systems of any camera. Instead of having a list-based scenario where we essentially have a list of items and then you have to dig into submenus to go do that, the way the Hasselblad system works with their UI is they just use a graphic interface. So it's kind of like using icons on a smartphone. You have icons that indicate the category of what you're going for, and then you go in, and usually things are a drop-down list or they're a tick box to turn on or off. Everything is very clear, and this is another big point for me with these and why there's one of my favorite camera systems available is that everything is just easy to use. So back to the sensor processor thing, I want to make a comment about image quality because the image quality is identical on both of these. Hasselblad in their processor use what they call the Hasselblad Natural Color System, which is just kind of a fancy thing that fits into an acronym, but it is really meaningful because you do get really accurate color reproduction on both of these cameras. As I mentioned earlier, we also have 16-bit files. We have 15 stops of dynamic range. And so what that means, and this is what gets interesting, and I think a lot of photographers miss the point on this. So first of all, this is very impressive when you look at it on a computer screen. And as we get into HDR monitors, having lots of dynamic range is something that's very visible and something that's very useful. However, what's really important about this is when you actually print your work out, it is a much different scenario. So on paper, really you're limited to about 8 stops of usable dynamic range before your detail areas start to disappear in highlights or shadows. So you're going from 15 stops on a camera to about 8 stops on a print. Now, why do I mention that? Well, what's really cool is when you have a dynamic range that's incredible as it is on both of these cameras, it allows you to do things like rescue highlights. It allows you to bring up shadow detail when it gets too dark. And so it allows you to play with how you want to see your image interpreted in that final print. And this is something that's really important because this is a huge aspect of photography. And when you don't have that kind of dynamic range, you're more limited in terms of what you can do when you're translating to that printed output. And so I want to mention that because I think that is another big draw to this whole system. When you have that kind of dynamic range and you've got 16-bit color, you have a lot of information to work with. All right, so now that we understand the similarities of what both of these cameras will offer, I want to talk about the differences because these are two different cameras designed for two types of preferences, depending on how you work as a photographer. So I want to start with the X2D. Now, the body design on the X2D is incredible. It ergonomically is one of my favorite cameras that I've ever used, and I've been saying this since I had the original X1D, which I actually still own. The camera's changed just a little bit over the incarnations from the X1D, the X1D Mark II, and now the X2D. It's a little bit thicker because now we have in-body image stabilization, and that is another really key point to the X2D. It is a 5-axis 7-stop image stabilization, and it is excellent. And what's really cool is I'm able to hand hold this camera in really low light and just be able to use it like at a 30th of a second and still have a really clear, clean image at the end. This allows me to do a couple things. First of all, you can work closer to the base ISO, which is going to give you the most dynamic range, which is 64 on these cameras. And the other thing that's really cool about that is it allows you to not have to shoot wide open when you're in low light all the time. I can stop down. If I need that depth of field, I'm not as worried about the limitations of ISO. I mean, we do have a bigger sensor. The ISO is pretty clean on both these cameras. It's usable up to about 6400 or so. Once you get above that, you're going to start kind of losing a lot of the benefits you have with medium format. But anyway, the in-body image stabilization is absolutely fantastic and is only available on the X2D. And the viewfinder on the X2D is actually one of the highlights on this camera for me. It is excellent. It's got a 5.7 million dot OLED display, and the bigger deal for me is it actually is a 1x magnification, so it's really good. There are displays that are a little bit higher resolving. Sony has a couple, but this one's really high, and the 1x magnification makes all the difference in the world to me. And so that is something that really is making the X2D a very appealing option. Another feature unique to the X2D is the top level display. I got to turn the camera on so you can see it. So this is actually extremely useful. Just at a glance, I can see what all my settings are without having to look at the back screen necessarily. It's great when you're on a tripod and you're actually shooting with the camera lower than eye point. So that's something that's really cool. And the other thing that's nice about this, it's very bright, it's very readable, and it also has other functions. Like if you're doing a firmware update, it gives you an icon, a little animation showing you that you're updating the firmware. It is very useful. This is something that we don't have on the 907X. Now, there is kind of a con with the X2D, and it comes down to flash sync. So we do have the hot shoe on the X2D, but that is the only point for using a flash. So if you're going to use something where you want to use use an old manual input like a jack or something, that's where the 907X is actually a little more versatile in that regard. So we are a little limited in the flash area on this. Another thing that's a little bit limiting, which I think is odd, is the X2D, you can't use a remote cable release. And the reason I say this is odd is because a lot of people want a really high resolution camera like this because they do a lot of landscape photography. When you're doing landscape photography, you want the option of having a cable release so you don't actually have to touch the camera. So the two workarounds that you have is you can use a timed release, and I'll set mine to 5 or 10 seconds. You can go ahead and hit the shutter button, and that gives a second for the tripod to settle in, and then the picture is made. The other option that you have, which is actually a pretty good option, is using the mobile app that Hasselblad have with Focus, and you can actually get a live view in there, and you can take pictures that way too. And so that's the only way you could do a cable release. Now there is a cable release that Hasselblad have, and it is not compatible with the X2D. It's kind of a weird thing. It used to be compatible with the X1D cameras, but they took that off of the X2D. So if you're going to be into that kind of thing, you're going to want something that's a little more of a studio type camera, and this is where I think the 907X comes into play. So we'll get into this idea of having a really small studio type camera in a second, but we do have the connectivity on here. So if I want to use my cable remote release, I can do that with the 907X. We can also do things like there's jacks in here for flash sync, and there's also a hot shoe, which is cool too, which you can put on here. And this was not available on the previous 50 megapixel option, but now we can actually take the back off, we remove the little plate, and we can slip in the optional hot shoe, which is Nikon compatible, just like the X2D, and it's actually a really cool option. Now, what's really cool is I'm showing you how you can attach the flash on this. The whole idea with the 907X is that it is a modular system, and I talked about this when the 50 megapixel version came out. It's one of my favorite things about this is that everything kind of comes apart and in pieces, and the idea being is that this back is removable, and now I can actually use this back with the old film V system models, which is really cool. Now the way this works is really simple. Once you attach the back, the 100 megapixel back will recognize the film camera body that you are using. You're going to see that displayed on the back. Now there's two ways you can go with this. You can turn on a live view, and this is great for critical focusing because sometimes using the old viewfinders, well, depending on how old your Hasselblad is, it's a little more difficult, but you can set that here, you can turn that off, and then what you're going to do is simply set the ISO from the back of the camera. You're going to use a light meter like you would if you were shooting film, and you use the camera as normal. When you take the picture, it's going to show up on the back screen, and it opens up a whole new set of possibilities of what you can do with your digital camera. One thing that I hope that Hasselblad decides to do one day, and I'm really praying for this, is I really would love to have the option of a monochrome back. I think it would be an incredible camera to have. They've not done a monochrome to this point, but I like the idea of being able to switch your backs out on a system between color and monochrome if you wanted. So that's something that remains to be seen, but hopefully that's something they'll consider in the future. Now, I mentioned this idea of the 907X as a small studio camera, which is exactly what I use mine for. It kind of lives on a tripod and it's in my studio, but it's so small and so out of the way most of the time. It's a really welcome addition. Now, I know photographers who are familiar with the H system, which was a big camera, and we called those studio queens, if you will, because they would just live on a tripod. They were massive. They were really heavy and hard to carry around. This one's different, and normally, you know, we associate a heavier camera being your studio camera. I love this lighter system being able to be that studio format. It just really works well. It's fast, it's easy to use, it's quick to set up, quick to move around, and it's really awesome. Now, I mentioned before that the 907X, one big differentiator on this that will be a negative to some, is that it does not have the viewfinder. So the only way that you can shoot with this is by using the back screen. Now, having said that, the screen that is on the 907X is excellent. It's a 2.3 million dot display. It's big, it's bright, you can crank it up. In fact, it's actually interesting because by default, it is pretty bright. And when I was doing the B-roll that you're watching in here with the menus and stuff, I actually had to turn this down to a very low setting just to get it from blowing highlights and blending in with the rest of the scene that I was doing. So it is an excellent viewfinder. And personally, I don't shoot in bright sunlight with this camera very much. If you do, that is going to be a deal breaker because it is a screen. It's just going to reflect. There's no viewfinder. So that is one thing that unfortunately will be a little bit of a drawback for some, and that's why you would want to use the X2D over the 907X. Another slight drawback to the 907X is because of the size of this and because it is so small, there is no room in here for in-body image stabilization. So it's something that Hasselblad don't have on this camera. Again, if you want to shoot in low light handheld, X2D is going to make more sense for you on that. Having said that though, because this body is so small, this is so much fun to use, and I've actually done street photography with this. It actually is very cool. Now, this is the 28mm lens that's on here, and obviously longer focal lengths are going to get bigger and change this format, but I love the fact that you have two options with this. I can use it just as the camera body like this, and I can do a lot with it. The downside to this is that you're a little bit limited on controls. You can do kind of everything from the back screen, so it's not completely limiting, but if you want to be able to touch buttons and assign custom functions and things like that, you will want to go with the optional grip. In fact, I wish they would just include this. I don't think this should be optional at all because it's so useful. If you want to be able to have a joystick for selecting autofocus points, it's got 2 dials on it. You've got buttons that you can customize and a shutter release and the whole thing. So that's one of the biggest differences between these is just the form factor. And it's a form factor that I actually love, and that's why I have both of these cameras. It's really cool. So those are the similarities and also the differences between the two Hasselblad models. Now, if you're trying to figure out which one is going to be right for you, I think it comes down to what type of photographer you are, and hopefully this video has been helpful. I think for most people, the X2D is probably going to be the option if you're only going to have one of these, because you have things like the viewfinder, you've got in-body image stabilization. It just makes more sense because this camera will enable you to do things that you can't necessarily do on the 907X. However, I think if you're a studio photographer, you're not going to shoot this outside very much. You only do portraits or in-studio setups. I think the 907X is a pretty awesome option, and you've got a little more flash compatibility with this. You can't go wrong with either one. But if you have any questions or comments, please drop them below. I will catch you guys in the next video. Until then, later.